Greeting, stranger. How are you enjoying the ride? We are now venturing at a good pace across the Darkmoon Plain. You may recall that its environment is fed by geysers and hot springs, many lurking just beneath the ground. One false step will send us both plummeting into scalding water, or into the very fires of the planet themselves. But don't worry. The trail is well maintained by the Lumber Consortium, and I have made the journey up to Falcon's Hollow many times. In fact, it was the first town I ever toured, in my current capacity, I mean. But more about that when we arrive. For now, let us continue to explore the languages of Golarion, and especially, now, beyond. It is all very well being able to hold a conversation at the local market, but for many adventurers, commercial hindrances will seldom be a problem. I know that you instead find yourselves challenged by ancient texts, riddles carved into semi-sentient doors, and the chanting of cultists who most likely have no idea what they are reciting either. Thus, we should focus now on the so-called uncommon languages, which are those that come from niche cultures and environments. Niche to the likes of your average inner-sea adventurer, anyway. Now, the uncommon languages of Golarion are as diverse as the people, creatures, and eldritch monsters who speak them. In fact, mentioning Golarion at all is something of a misnomer, given that the majority of the languages we will discuss today have their origins in other planes and dimensions altogether. Still, our beloved planet does not lack languages, and therefore I think it is best to divide the discussion into two broad halves. The first comprises those Golarion languages that most adventurers would find most useful to study, while the second takes us across the planes. Before we can introduce them, though, a disclaimer must be given. This list barely scratches the surface of what lies in the wide world to be uncovered. Do not think that this overview can prepare you for every local tongue or every country's lexicon. By the maelstrom I can barely communicate with myself sometimes. Nevertheless, with that disclosed, let us begin. A Golarion language can be considered uncommon within the Inner Sea for essentially one of two reasons. Either it has a low population of native speakers, or it predominates beyond the region. In the first category lie Hallit, Shoanti, Skald, and Varisian, all of which are human languages. Hallit is the primary language of the Kelish peoples, unjustly dismissed as barbarians by the southern empires, and is hardly uncommon in the north and northeast of Aveston. The Kelish peoples traditionally organize themselves into tribes, and the few that do command a written language seldom use it. Consequently, the spoken word is far more important than the written word for Hallit, and the language resists a dry, academic approach to its study. One must sally forth and engage with it in the wider world. Shoanti is named after the people who speak it, who inhabit the plains, mountains, and wastelands of Varisia. Unlike some languages, Goblin, for example, to be fluent in Shoanti is to be fluent in metaphor, for almost every phrase is packed with allegory, imagery, and deep symbolism. The grammar is otherwise straightforward, though, and speakers of Hallit, Jotun, Thessalonian, or Varisian will find that they can communicate their basic concepts and ideas without too much difficulty. Skald is primarily spoken in the icy lands of the Linorm Kings in the northwest of Aveston, but you might encounter speakers in its neighbouring lands as well. The language is most notable for using dwarven runes over Geistkan letters in writing, with only a couple of telltale exceptions imported from Taldane. Skald is also very lyrical and pleasant on the ear. At least it is when a blizzard isn't snatching the words from the speaker's mouth before they can reach it. Varisian is, surprise surprise, spoken in Varisia. Specifically, it belongs to the Varisian people, who are nomadic travellers distinct from the Shoanti. Consequently, it enjoys a lot more geographic diversity than Shoanti. You can find speakers in neighbouring Nemuthis, Multhun, Nidal, even as far east as Ustalav. The language is grammatically complex and difficult for an untrained tongue to pronounce, and famous for its subtlety, in complete contrast with the grand metaphors of Shoanti. Now, in the second category of uncommon Golarion languages, we have Amurrun, Aklo, Iruxi, Kelish, Kholo, and Necril. Amurrun, Iruxi, and Kholo are all spoken by their respective ancestries, often referred to in common as the Catfolk, Lizardfolk, and Gnolls, respectively. Of these, Kholo is undoubtedly the hardest to speak, as it relies on guttural barks and growls, similar to how goblins speak their language, albeit around 3 octaves lower. Kelish, meanwhile, is a human language that dominates the tongues of those living in the Great Padishah Empire to the east. On the continent of Khazmaron, it is considered the common language. To a foreigner, it might be seen as a phlegmatic language with very limited emotional expression, but with enough practice you will discover it to be a tongue rich in history and utility. Qadira is naturally the only place in the Inner Sea where it is spoken natively, but the city at the center of the world, almighty Absalom, also boasts a sizable population of Kelish speakers. The final 2 languages, Aklo and Necril, are both considered Darklands tongues to linguists. Aklo is believed to have been developed, or at least spread, by the Sekhmins, or Serpent Folk, of old. Before their defeat at the hands of the Aslantes, the Sekhmins commanded a vast surface empire, and even today control most of Sekka Minor beneath us, which takes its name from their presence. Their language is fittingly sibilance-heavy, but its most notable quality is probably its diversity of native speakers. Besides the Serpent Folk, Aklo is also spoken by hags, linorms, skelms, many fey creatures, and even extraplanar beings like the inhabitants of Lang. It is not entirely clear how Aklo has spread so far, but the result is a language that inspires fear in humanoids who can recognize its words. Necril is the language of ghouls and other intelligent undead, and has become so ubiquitous among them that many assume speaking it is some sort of inherent ability that one possesses on instinct if one becomes undead. In truth, it is simply a language like any other, albeit one with more words for death and decay than I am comfortable acknowledging. Linguistically, Necril bears a curious similarity to ancient Assyriani, as well as Sakfroth and Aklo, giving speakers of those languages an advantage in studying it. Nevertheless, the fastest way to master it might be simply to hang around enough cemeteries after dark, provided you bring weapons and quills in equal measure. Now, the remaining languages stray beyond this planet, and even this universe, into the great beyond. Broadly, they can be categorized according to the cosmology of the multiverse, as understood by Golarion's scholars at least. Thus, we can speak of the inner sphere languages, the outer sphere languages, and the transitive planar languages. The inner sphere comprises the 6 elemental planes: air, wood, water, earth, metal, and fire, traditionally in that order. Each has its own language, and they are all quite distinct. Petran, also called Terran, is the language of the plane of Earth, being spoken mostly by the elementals who dwell there. It is a runic language, slow to write, but even slower to speak. The number 1 advice teachers tell their students is to speak more slowly. And even that was too fast. The older one is, the more slowly one is expected to speak as a sign of wisdom and experience. Pyric, also called Ignan, is the language of the plane of fire, and it is almost the exact opposite. It emphasizes speed and plosive sounds, relying on its fluid grammar to compensate for its somewhat haphazard way of presenting concepts. I warn you, if you learn it, you will forever be second-guessing your fireplace, especially if you are inclined to paranoia. Muan is the language of the plane of wood, and perhaps one of the most understudied tongues on this list. Its written form fascinates me, for it demands that its scribes annotate the intended tones and even speeds of the would-be speaker. In other words, it is the only language where you can determine a writer's accent from their diary. Sussuran, also known as Auran, is spoken within the plane of air. It numbers among the quietest languages because its native speakers often rely on the winds to carry or throw their voices beyond their natural limits. Thus, you need healthy lungs to speak properly, and coughing at the wrong moment can cause great offence if not explained promptly. Trust me on that one. Talican is the language of the plane of metal, and in my opinion it is the only language that is more or less impossible for an organic creature to speak without magical assistance. The clangs, whirs, and beeps of a native Talican speaker give no regard to biology. The written form is similarly opaque, being expressed as ridges and bumps on metal sheets that parchment cannot hope to match. Why? Well, because true Talican can only be written on magnetic materials. So if you need to communicate with an entity that only speaks this tongue, you should just hire a mage who can cast True Speech on your behalf. Finally, we have Thalassic, also known as Aquan. The language of the plane of water is, as you might expect, mostly concerned with all things aquatic. It has more words for water in all its manifestations than humans do for their own emotions. It sounds deep and slow to most outsiders' ears, though not nearly to the same degree as Petran. And now there is some evidence that Thalassic is the progenitor of all the other elemental languages, though scholars continue to debate the finer points of this claim. Overall, if you had to learn a single Inner Sphere language, I would personally recommend Thalassic as your best choice. As for the languages of the Outer Sphere, you would be forgiven for thinking that there were 9, 1 for each plane. Yet there are, in fact, only 7, because the so-called upper planes all speak a single, united tongue called Empyrean, or sometimes Celestial. Whether you are conversing with an angel, archon, agathion, or a zata, Empyrean ought to be your language of choice. It is a soft language with very few voiced consonants or vowels, and actually shares its writing system with Draconic. The reasons for this are not known for certain, but surely give Draconic speakers an edge in learning this noble tongue. The fiends of the lower planes, in contrast, all speak their own languages. Devils of the Pit speak Diabolic, sometimes also called Infernal. This language is well suited to their native speakers' penchant for word traps, as it is replete with homophones and confusing metaphors. Many devils will insist on using Diabolic in their contracts for precisely this reason, and you need to be fluent to have a chance of negotiating successfully. Demons, on the other hand, speak Chthonian, which misleadingly is also called Abyssal. I call this misleading because it connects the language with the abyss, that is the outer rifts, too strongly. In practice, Chthonian was the very first language developed by outsiders and predates demons. In fact, if you needed to learn a single lower planes language, I would suggest Chthonian without hesitation. Unfortunately, the only consistent thing about it is the rapidity with which it evolves. Learning it is one thing, but being able to use what you have learned a decade later is quite another. Daemonic is the language of the daemons of Abaddon, and yes, their name is distressingly similar to demons, but no, there is nothing I can do about that. Be reassured that the language is at least different enough to be obvious, for Daemonic has remained unchanged for at least as long as I have been alive, and is likely to stay that way long after I am gone. Finally, we have the languages of the Middle Planes, Protean, Requian, and Utopian. Protean is what you will need if you decide to venture into the Maelstrom, and just like Chthonian, it is constantly in flux. In many ways, it is even more difficult to learn than its demonic counterpart, for Proteans prefer to vocalize their language through a series of pitched hisses that humanoids find very difficult to reproduce. Requian is spoken by the psychopomps of the Boneyard. Pharasma's clerics also use it when producing their sacred texts, so I imagine it is the most straightforward language to learn of the three. It is very unusual to hear it spoken natively though, for the Lady of Grave's messengers much prefer to communicate with each other in private, and leave the talking to the Katrinas. Utopian is the language of Axis, the Eternal City, and I must say it is, frankly, boring. Formulaic and efficient to the point of agony. The only reason one would learn this mechanical language is to communicate with an Aeon. The best part is that senior Aeons don't even use the language because they instead project images through a process called envisioning. Needless to say, I find Utopian rather underwhelming. The final 3 languages of the plains are Fey Common, Yoti, and Shadow Tongue, which are spoken by natives of the First World, Creation's Forge, and the Netherworld, respectively. Fey Common is also called the First Speech, and has been largely replaced by Fey these days, being mostly held in trust for formal occasions and traditional gatherings of courtly folks. It is also so similar to Fey that I would argue it could be considered a dialect rather than its own tongue. I mention it here because, unlike Fey, you will never hear it spoken beyond the borders of the First World, for reasons best left to the eldest and tame. Yoti is the language of the people of the same name who dwell in crystal cities within Creation's Forge. It might be ignorant of me to declare the language representative of the plane as a whole, but there is, to my knowledge, no other civilization that inhabits that mysterious place. The language is likewise a mystery, even to me, though I would describe its sound as ephemeral yet fricative. Finally, Shadow Tongue is the language of the Velstrax who dwell in the netherworld that borders ours. It is a harsh, slithering language that elaborates marvellously on all the kinds of pain a living being can experience at the expense of other terms. They say that every idiom in Shadow Tongue references suffering in one way or another. This language is also spoken by much of the population of Nidal, an accursed land bordering Varisia and Cheliax. It is not known whether the Velstrax taught the Nidalese their language or vice versa, but both populations now speak it when praising their dark masters. Well, stranger, there we have almost all of the uncommon languages. There are plenty of others waiting to be discovered in the corners of the world, but I would start with the ones we have discussed already before learning more. I speak most of them, so if you ever wish to practice pragmatic parlance in another language with me, do not hesitate to tell me. In the meantime, I will focus on navigating the Darkmoon Plains safely. With any luck, we should reach Falcon's Hollow tomorrow. I can ride very swiftly when pressed. Well, until then.